My stepfather demands I hand over my lottery winnings because he's the man of the house after he kicked me out at 18. My mom married Dennis when I was 14. He moved into our house, took over the master bedroom, and immediately started making rules. His house, his rules. That's what he said. Except it wasn't his house. It was my mom's house. My real dad left it to her when he died. But Dennis acted like he owned everything the moment he put a ring on her finger. He made me call him sir. He gave me a curfew of 8 p.m. even on weekends. He complained about how much food I ate. He said I was a financial burden. When I turned 16, he told me I needed to start paying rent. $300 a month. I was in high school. I got a job at a fast food place just to pay him. My mom didn't say anything. She never said a word about Dennis. She just looked at the floor and told me it would teach me a lesson in responsibility. I worked 20 hours a week during school and 30 during summers. I paid Dennis every single month. I never missed once. He never said thank you. He never said he was proud of me. He just took the money and told me I was learning how the real world worked. The day I turned 18, 2 weeks after graduation, Dennis told me I had 30 days to move out. He said I was an adult now. He said he and my mom needed their privacy. He said I'd been a guest long enough. My mom cried, but she didn't fight for me. She just helped me pack my things and slipped me $200 when Dennis wasn't looking. I moved into a room I rented from an old lady across town. I worked full-time at a warehouse and took night classes at community college. I didn't ask Dennis or my mom for anything. Not money, not help, not advice. I figured out everything on my own. How to file taxes, how to fix a car, how to budget so I could eat and pay tuition at the same time. It took me 6 years to get my degree. I became an accountant. Not glamorous, but steady. Good salary, good benefits, room to grow. I moved into my own apartment, then my own condo. I built a life completely separate from Dennis and my mom. I saw them maybe twice a year. Thanksgiving and my mom's birthday. Dennis always made comments about my job, my car, my clothes. He said accountants were boring. He said I should have gone into business like him. He ran a failing landscaping company that my mom's money kept afloat. But sure, I was the one who made bad choices. I stopped letting his comments bother me. I just smiled, helped my mom with the dishes, and left as soon as I could. 3 months ago, I won the lottery. Not the massive jackpot, but enough. $470,000 after taxes. I didn't tell anyone at first. I paid off my condo. I put a chunk into savings. I bought a new car. Nothing flashy, just reliable. I donated some to a shelter that helped me once when I was 19 and between jobs. I told my mom about a month later. I asked her to keep it between us. I should have known better. She told Dennis that same night. He called me the next morning, not to congratulate me, not to say he was happy for me. He wanted to meet for lunch. He said we needed to discuss the family finances. I should have said no. But part of me was curious. I wanted to see what he would actually say to my face. We met at a diner near his house. He looked the same. Same polo shirt, same smug expression, same way of looking at me like I was still a 16-year-old handing over rent money. He didn't waste time. He said the lottery winnings needed to be distributed fairly. He said he was the head of the family. He said my mom had sacrificed so much to raise me. He said the least I could do was share my good fortune. He had a number in mind, $200,000. He said he'd take it in a lump sum. He said he'd use it to expand his landscaping business. He said it was an investment in the family's future. I asked him what he meant by family. He said him, my mom, and me. We were a unit. We needed to support each other. I reminded him that he kicked me out at 18. He said I needed to grow up. I reminded him that he never once helped me with college, with my first apartment, with anything. He said I was keeping score like a child. Then he got angry. He said I was being selfish. He said my mom was embarrassed by how greedy I was being. He said no one in the family would respect me if I kept the money all to myself. He said he was the man of the house and he had final say on financial matters. He actually thought being married to my mom gave him some kind of authority over my bank account. I let him talk for another 10 minutes. He had plans. A new truck for the business. A vacation for him and my mom. Maybe a boat. He talked like the money was already his. Like I was just a minor obstacle between him and a spending spree. When he finally stopped, I told him I wasn't giving him anything. His face went from normal to bright red in about 2 seconds. His voice got louder. People at other tables started looking over at us. He told me I was being selfish and ungrateful. He said family takes care of family. He said I was spitting on everything he and my mom did for me. I kept my voice calm and steady. I reminded him that he kicked me out when I turned 18. I said I've been supporting myself ever since that day. I told him we clearly have very different ideas about what family means. His jaw clenched. His hands gripped the edge of the table. But he didn't have a good answer to that. He switched tactics fast. His voice got softer, almost sad. He said my mom cries every night about how distant I've become. He said money was destroying our relationship. He said she missed having her daughter in her life. I pointed out that he was the one who called this meeting. I said he was the one demanding my money, not me. He slammed his hand down on the table. The silverware jumped. More people looked over. He said I had 1 week to think about what kind of daughter I wanted to be. Then he stood up and walked out. He didn't pay for his coffee. I sat there for another minute, then paid the bill and left. I made it to my car before my hands started shaking. I gripped the steering wheel and just sat there in the parking lot for 20 minutes. Part of me knew this would happen. I knew Dennis would try something like this. But hearing him actually say the words, actually demand my money like he had some right to it, made me so angry I could barely think straight. I started the car and drove back to my condo. I went straight to my laptop. I spent the whole evening looking up stuff about family financial pressure and legal protections. I read about other people whose relatives tried to claim they were owed lottery winnings. I learned about cease and desist letters and harassment laws. I made notes. I saved websites. I felt a little better having information, having a plan. My phone rang around 8 that night. Mom. Her voice sounded small and apologetic when I answered. She said Dennis was very upset. She said maybe I could just help them a little bit. Not the full amount, she said, but something to show I care. I asked her why she told Dennis about the lottery when I asked her not to. She went quiet for a few seconds. Then she said she tells her husband everything. That's what married people do, she said. I felt something break inside my chest when she said that. I told her I already paid off my condo. I said I put money away for my future. I said I donated to charity. I said I'm not giving Dennis anything. She started crying. She said I was tearing the family apart over money. She said I've changed. She said I used to be such a sweet girl. I told her I'm the same person who paid rent at 16. I said I'm the same person who got kicked out at 18. I said nothing about me has changed except now I have money and Dennis wants it. She kept crying. I ended the call. The next morning, I looked up lawyers who handle family law and financial protection. I found Caroline Donaldson. Her website said she helps people protect their assets from family pressure. I called her office and got an appointment for that afternoon. I sat in her office and explained everything. Dennis demanding $200,000, the diner meeting, my mom's phone call. Caroline took notes the whole time. She wrote down dates and details. She asked questions about Dennis's exact words and my mom's involvement. When I finished, she looked up at me and said, "This happens more than people think." She said we need to protect my assets right away. Caroline told me to document everything from now on. Every conversation with Dennis. Every phone call from my mom about money. Every text message. She said if Dennis tries to make legal threats or harasses me, I'll need a clear record of everything. She explained that having documentation makes all the difference if things get worse. I went home that night and started a detailed log. I wrote down everything I could remember from the diner meeting. What Dennis said. What I said. The exact amount he demanded. The way he slammed his hand on the table. I wrote it all down with dates and times. I met with Gary Freeman, my accountant, 2 days later. I explained the situation with Dennis and my mom. Gary helped me restructure my accounts. He added extra security measures. He set up beneficiary designations that completely exclude Dennis. Gary said he's seen this before. Family members claiming they're owed lottery winnings. He said legal documentation is the best protection I can get. I felt safer leaving his office. I had lawyers and accountants and documentation. I had protection. 3 days after the diner, Dennis called my phone directly. His voice sounded friendly and reasonable. Like the diner fight never happened. He said he overreacted. He said he's not asking for the full amount anymore. Just $50,000 to help with the business. Just enough to get things stable, he said. I told him I'm not giving him any amount. I said he needs to stop contacting me about this. I kept my voice firm. His tone changed instantly. The friendly voice disappeared. He said I was going to regret this. He said I was making a huge mistake. He said family doesn't forget betrayal. His voice got louder with each sentence. I told him that threatening me was a bad idea. I said I'm documenting everything he says. Then I hung up. My hands were shaking again. But I felt stronger than I did at the diner. I had lawyers now. I had protection. I had proof of what he was doing. The next morning, my phone lit up with a text from my mom. Then another, then 3 more in a row. I opened the messages and saw paragraphs of text about how hard things were right now. She said the landscaping business was losing money every month. She said Dennis was working 14-hour days trying to keep things going. She said he came home exhausted and stressed and she hated seeing him like that. She said maybe if the business had a little help, just enough to get through this rough patch, everything would be okay again. She never used the word money. She never directly asked me for anything. But every single sentence was designed to make me feel guilty. Every word was crafted to make me picture Dennis suffering and my mom suffering and all of it being my fault because I had money and wouldn't share. I read through all the messages twice. Then I opened my phone's camera and took screenshots of every single one. I saved them to a folder I'd created called documentation. I didn't respond. I put my phone face down on my desk and went back to work. 2 days later, I met Jeremy for lunch at a cafe near our office. Jeremy and I had worked together for 3 years. He was the person I talked to about everything. The person who knew about my terrible dates and my car troubles and my annoying neighbor who played drums at midnight. But I'd never told him much about my family. I'd mentioned my mom a few times. I'd said my stepdad and I didn't get along. But I'd never explained the whole story. I told him everything that day. About Dennis charging me rent at 16. About getting kicked out at 18. About working my way through college alone. About winning the lottery and Dennis demanding $200,000 like it was his right. About my mom's guilt trip text that filled my phone every morning. Jeremy put down his sandwich halfway through and just stared at me. He said he had no idea. He said he thought I just had a normal distant relationship with my parents, not this. He said Dennis sounded like a piece of work, and my mom wasn't much better. He asked what I was going to do. I told him I wasn't giving them anything. I said I had a lawyer now and I was documenting everything. Jeremy nodded and said that was smart. Then he said something that made me feel less alone than I had in weeks. He said if Dennis ever showed up again, if I ever needed someone there for backup, he would come. He said I shouldn't have to face this alone. I thanked him and meant it. A week after the diner meeting, I was at my desk going through spreadsheets when my desk phone rang. It was the receptionist downstairs. Her voice sounded uncertain. She said my stepfather was in the lobby asking to see me. My heart started pounding immediately. I asked her to repeat what she said. She said a man named Dennis was here, and he said he was my stepfather, and he needed to talk to me about something important. I told her I wasn't available. I said to please ask him to leave. She said okay, and the line went quiet. I sat there staring at my computer screen, not seeing anything. My hands were shaking. Dennis had come to my workplace. He'd actually driven to my office building and walked into the lobby like he had any right to be there. The audacity of it made me furious and scared at the same time. My phone rang again 5 minutes later. The receptionist again. She sounded more uncomfortable now. She said Dennis was refusing to leave. She said he was insisting he just needed 5 minutes to talk to his daughter about family matters. She asked what she should do. I told her to get my manager. I said this was harassment and I wanted him removed from the building. I heard her put me on hold. Then voices in the background. Then my manager's voice came on the line asking what was going on. I explained as calmly as I could that my stepfather had shown up uninvited and was refusing to leave when asked. My manager said he'd handle it and hung up. I sat frozen at my desk for the next 10 minutes. I couldn't focus on work. I kept imagining Dennis down in the lobby making a scene. Everyone in my office seeing this. Everyone knowing my personal drama. Then my manager came to my desk. He said Dennis was gone. He said he'd told Dennis very firmly that he needed to leave or they would call security. Dennis had argued for a few minutes, saying he just wanted to talk, saying this was a family matter. But he'd finally left. As he walked out, he'd shouted loud enough for everyone in the lobby to hear that I couldn't avoid him forever. My manager asked if I was okay. I said yes, even though I wasn't. He said if Dennis came back, they would call the police immediately. I thanked him and tried to go back to work, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I was humiliated. Everyone on my floor had probably heard about this by now. The accounting department wasn't that big. People talked. I pulled up my email and sent a message to Caroline explaining what had just happened. She responded within an hour. She said this was harassment and we needed to send a formal cease and desist letter immediately. She said showing up at my workplace after I'd told him to stop contacting me about money was a clear violation of boundaries. She asked if I wanted her to draft the letter. I wrote back and said yes. I authorized her to send whatever she thought was appropriate. Part of me felt relieved. Taking legal action felt like finally having some protection. But part of me was anxious about what Dennis would do when he got a letter from a lawyer. Would it make things better or worse? That evening, my phone rang. My mom. I almost didn't answer, but I knew she'd just keep calling. I picked up. She was crying before I even said hello. She said I'd had Dennis thrown out of my workplace like he was some kind of criminal. She said I was destroying him. She said he was a good man who just wanted to talk to me and I'd humiliated him in front of strangers. I cut her off. I said Dennis showed up at my job uninvited. I said I told him through the receptionist that I wasn't available and asked him to leave. I said he refused and made a scene and that was on him, not me. She kept crying. She said I'd changed. She said I'd become cold and cruel. She said the daughter she raised would never treat family this way. I wanted to scream. I wanted to remind her that the daughter she raised was the one who paid rent at 16 and got kicked out at 18. But I just said I had to go and hung up. The next day, I looked up therapists who specialized in family dynamics. I found Lorelei Richards. Her website said she helped people set boundaries with difficult family members. I called and got an appointment for the end of the week. When I walked into her office, she smiled and gestured to a comfortable chair. She asked me to tell her what brought me in. I started explaining about Dennis and the lottery money. But then I found myself going back further. To being 14 and Dennis moving in, to paying rent in high school, to getting kicked out, to my mom never standing up for me. To this pattern of my mom choosing Dennis over me again and again for 16 years. I started crying halfway through. Not quiet tears, but full sobbing that I couldn't control. Lorelai handed me tissues and waited. When I finally stopped, she said something that hit me hard. She said my mother's passivity wasn't passive at all. She said every time my mom stood by and let Dennis treat me badly, that was an active choice. She said my mom was choosing her comfort over my well-being. She said that was painful to accept, but it was important to see clearly. I nodded. I'd never thought about it that way before. I'd always told myself my mom was just weak or scared of Dennis. But Lorelai was right. My mom was making choices. She was choosing Dennis every single time. 3 days later, Caroline called to tell me the cease and desist letter had been sent via certified mail. She read me the key parts over the phone. It stated clearly that Dennis must stop contacting me about money. It said he must stop showing up at my home or workplace. It said any future communication needed to go through attorneys. The letter was firm and professional. Caroline said Dennis would have to sign for it so we'd have proof he received it. I felt protected having this legal documentation. I felt like I'd finally drawn a line that had consequences behind it. But I also felt sad. It shouldn't have to be this way. Families shouldn't need lawyers. 2 days after that, my mom called again. She said Dennis was so hurt by the legal letter that he could barely function. She said he was depressed and angry and felt attacked. She said I was breaking her heart and destroying her marriage. She asked how I could be so heartless to the man who raised me. I took a deep breath. I said Dennis didn't raise me. I said he charged me rent and kicked me out and now he wanted my money. I said if their marriage was destroyed, it was because Dennis couldn't accept that I had boundaries. She started crying again. She said I was tearing the family apart. I said the family was already torn apart 16 years ago when Dennis kicked me out. She hung up on me. The next morning, my mom texted asking me to come to dinner at the house. She said we needed to talk things through like a family. She said Dennis promised he would be calm and reasonable. She said they just wanted to find a compromise everyone could live with. I stared at the text for a long time. Every instinct told me this was a bad idea. Lorelai had told me in our last session that I didn't owe Dennis another conversation. She said I'd already stated my boundaries clearly, and going to this dinner would just give him another chance to manipulate me. But part of me wanted to believe my mom. Part of me wanted to think maybe we could actually talk and reach some kind of understanding. Part of me still hoped my mom would finally stand up for me. I texted back and said I would come to dinner. One dinner. To see if we could have a productive conversation. My mom responded immediately with a heart emoji and said Saturday at 6. I already regretted saying yes. Saturday came too fast. I spent the morning checking my documentation file 3 times, making sure I had everything organized. Bank statements, the cease and desist letter, Caroline's business card, text message screenshots. I felt like I was preparing for a trial instead of dinner with my mother. I texted Jeremy around noon to let him know the plan. He told me to call him if things got bad, that he'd drive over if I needed him. Having someone in my corner made the whole thing feel less scary. I drove to my mother's house just before 6, parking on the street instead of the driveway so I could leave quickly if I needed to. The house looked exactly the same as it always did. Same beige siding, same flower beds my mother kept neat, same front door I'd walked through 1,000 times as a kid. But walking up to it now, I felt 14 again. Small and powerless and waiting for Dennis to tell me what I'd done wrong. I knocked instead of using my old key. My mother answered right away, her face lighting up like I'd given her a gift just by showing up. She hugged me tight and I smelled her familiar perfume, the same kind she'd worn my whole life. She led me inside and I saw Dennis sitting at the dining room table. He was in what used to be my father's chair at the head of the table. He'd been sitting there for 16 years like it belonged to him. Like everything in this house belonged to him. My mother had set the table with her nice dishes, the ones she only used for holidays. There were serving bowls of food already out. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans. My mother's hands were shaking slightly as she gestured for me to sit. I took the chair farthest from Dennis. He nodded at me but didn't stand up or offer to shake my hand. We sat in awkward silence while my mother brought out rolls and poured water into our glasses. She was moving too fast, too nervous, filling the quiet with the sounds of dishes and silverware. Dennis asked me to pass the potatoes. I handed them over. He asked how work was going. I said it was fine. He asked if my condo needed any repairs. I said no. My mother kept offering me more food, piling things onto my plate like I was still a teenager who needed feeding. She asked about my car, about my neighbors, about whether I was sleeping okay. Small talk that felt like walking through a minefield. Every question felt loaded, like we were all waiting for someone to say what we were really here to talk about. Dennis ate slowly, cutting his chicken into precise pieces. He complimented my mother's cooking. He mentioned that the landscaping business had picked up a few new clients. He talked about the weather. It was all so normal on the surface, but I could feel the tension underneath. My mother's smile was too bright. Dennis's voice was too calm. I barely tasted the food. After we finished eating, my mother started clearing plates. Dennis leaned back in his chair and cleared his throat. He said he wanted to apologize for how he'd acted at the diner and at my workplace. He said the business had been struggling and he'd let his stress get the better of him. He said he understood that I'd built my own life and he respected that. The words sounded rehearsed, like he'd practiced them. My mother was nodding along from the kitchen doorway, encouraging him. I thanked him for the apology and waited. I knew there was more coming. Dennis folded his hands on the table and said that while he understood my position, family should help family in times of crisis. He said he'd thought about it a lot and he wasn't asking for the original amount anymore. He said $25,000 would be enough, just enough to save the business and keep things stable. My mother came back to the table and sat down. She jumped in to say it wasn't really about Dennis's pride, it was about her security. She said the business supported both of them, and if it failed, she'd be affected too. She asked if I didn't want to protect my own mother. I felt the familiar guilt rising in my chest, that old feeling of being responsible for my mother's happiness. But I pushed it down. I told them I'd offered to help my mother directly years ago, back when I first got my accounting job and had some savings. I reminded her that she'd refused because Dennis said they didn't need my help. I said I wasn't giving them money now, especially not for a business that Dennis had run into the ground. Dennis's face darkened. His jaw clenched and his hands tightened on the table edge. My mother looked like she might start crying. She said that was different. That was before things got so bad. Dennis said I was being unreasonable. He said $25,000 was nothing to me now, barely a dent in what I had. He said I was choosing money over family. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. He said I was just like my father, cold and selfish with money. It was a low blow and he knew it. My father had left my mother the house specifically to protect her, to make sure she'd always have a roof over her head. And Dennis had been living in that house rent-free for 16 years, acting like he owned it. I stood up. I said this dinner was over and I wasn't discussing money with them again. My mother grabbed my arm. Her fingers dug into my sleeve and she begged me not to leave angry. She said we were family and we could work this out if we just kept talking. Dennis stood up too. He said if I walked out that door, I was choosing to be an outsider to this family. He said I'd regret turning my back on them. I pulled my arm free from my mother's grip. I told Dennis I'd been an outsider since he kicked me out at 18. I told him I'd been working this out on my own for 12 years. I walked to the door and my mother followed me, still pleading. I left without looking back. I sat in my car for 10 minutes before I could drive, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. Over the next 2 weeks, my phone became a battlefield. My aunt called on a Tuesday evening. She said she'd heard I won money and wouldn't help my own mother in her time of need. She said family was supposed to stick together. She made it sound like I was abandoning my mother on purpose, like I was cruel. My cousin texted me 3 days later asking if the rumors were true that I was letting Dennis lose his business out of spite. He said he'd always thought I was better than that. I got a call from my mother's friend asking if there was anything she could do to help me see reason. Each contact made it clearer that Dennis was spreading his version of events. He was telling everyone I was greedy and heartless. He was leaving out the part where he kicked me out, the part where he charged me rent as a teenager, the part where he showed up at my workplace. I reached out to my aunt directly. I called her back and asked if we could talk. I explained the full history. I told her about paying rent at 16, about being kicked out 2 weeks after graduation, about working my way through college with no help, about Dennis demanding $200,000. She went quiet on the other end of the line. When she finally spoke, her voice was different. She said she didn't know those details. She said Dennis had made it sound like I was just being greedy with unexpected money, that he and my mother had always supported me. I asked her to share the truth with other family members who'd been contacting me. She said she would. Some family members apologized after hearing the full story. My cousin called back and said he was sorry for jumping to conclusions. My mother's friend sent a text saying she understood now why I'd set boundaries. But others sided with Dennis anyway. My uncle said family helps family regardless of past conflicts. Another aunt said I should be the bigger person and let go of old grudges. A few cousins stopped responding to my messages entirely. I was hurt but not surprised. These were people who hadn't been there for the hard years. They hadn't seen me working fast food at 16 to pay Dennis rent. They hadn't helped when I was sleeping on an air mattress in a rented room. They hadn't offered anything when I was eating ramen to afford textbooks, but now they had opinions about what I should do with my money. I started limiting contact with extended family who wouldn't respect my boundaries. I stopped answering calls from numbers I didn't recognize. I muted group chats where people kept bringing up the situation. I focused on the people who actually supported me. Jeremy, Caroline, Lorelai. The people who knew the whole story and stood by me anyway. Jeremy took me to a small Italian place on the other side of town, somewhere quiet where I could actually breathe. He ordered us both wine without asking and told me to pick whatever I wanted from the menu. I wasn't hungry, but I ordered pasta anyway, because he looked worried, and I didn't want him to think I was falling apart. We sat in a corner booth away from other people, and he let me talk. I told him about the extended family calls, the accusations, the way Dennis was twisting everything to make me look like the villain. Jeremy listened without interrupting, and when I finally stopped talking, he said something that made me cry right there at the table. He said I survived being kicked out at 18 with nothing but $200 and a rented room. He said I worked through 6 years of college while supporting myself completely alone. He said I built a career and bought a condo and made a life that was stable and good. He said the lottery money was pure luck, just random chance, and I didn't owe Dennis a single dollar of it. He said Dennis didn't help me study, didn't help me move, didn't celebrate when I graduated, didn't do anything a real parent does. Jeremy said I needed to stop letting guilt eat me alive when I had nothing to feel guilty about. His outside perspective helped more than he knew, because when you're in the middle of family drama, it's hard to see clearly. I went home that night feeling stronger, like maybe I wasn't the terrible person Dennis was making me out to be. A month passed after the family dinner and things got quiet. Too quiet. I should have known Dennis wasn't done, but part of me hoped he'd finally given up. Then my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize, and I almost didn't answer. The voice on the other end said his name was Nathaniel Crouch, and he was Dennis's business partner in the landscaping company. He apologized for contacting me out of nowhere, but said he was worried about Dennis and my mother. My stomach dropped because business partners don't usually call the family unless something is really wrong. Nathaniel explained that Dennis had been taking money from my mother's personal accounts to cover business expenses. He said the landscaping company was losing money every month, and Dennis kept promising things would turn around, but they never did. Nathaniel said he'd seen the bank statements because Dennis needed him to co-sign something, and the numbers were bad. Really bad. He said my mother's savings were disappearing into a failing business and she might not even know how much was gone. Nathaniel kept talking, and I could hear the stress in his voice. He said he was trying to exit the partnership because Dennis's financial decisions were getting reckless, and he didn't want legal liability when everything collapsed. He said Dennis was desperate and desperate people make dangerous choices. Nathaniel thought I should know that my mother might be in serious financial trouble because of Dennis's business failures. He didn't want money from me, and he wasn't asking me to get involved. He just thought someone in the family should know what was really happening. I thanked him for calling and told him I appreciated the warning. As soon as we hung up, I pulled up Caroline's number and called her immediately. She answered on the second ring, and I explained what Nathaniel had just told me. Caroline went quiet for a moment and then asked about my mother's house, the one my father left her. I told her my mother owned it outright with no mortgage because my dad had paid it off before he died. Caroline said that was good because it meant Dennis couldn't mortgage the house without my mother's signature, but he could definitely be pressuring her to do exactly that. Caroline told me to check the county property records online to see if any liens had been filed against the house. She walked me through how to access the public records, and I spent the rest of the evening searching through documents I barely understood. Most of it looked normal, just the original deed transfer from my father to my mother and the property tax records. Then I found something dated 2 weeks ago. Dennis had tried to take out a home equity line of credit on my mother's house. The application was there in the public records, requesting $75,000 against the property. My hands started shaking as I read through the details. The application listed both Dennis and my mother as applicants, but I knew my mother would never risk the house my father left her unless Dennis pushed her into it. I screenshot everything and sent it to Caroline with a message asking what this meant. She responded within minutes saying the application existed, but she'd need to check if it was approved. I couldn't sleep that night thinking about Dennis trying to take the one thing my father made sure my mother would always have. The next morning, I called my mother directly. She answered on the fourth ring, sounding tired, and I asked her straight out if Dennis was trying to mortgage the house. She got quiet, and I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line. I asked again, more gently this time, and she finally admitted that Dennis said it was the only way to save the business and their future. I felt sick. I told her that house was her security, the one thing that was completely hers, and she shouldn't risk it for Dennis's failing company. She said I didn't understand the pressure she was under, that Dennis was her husband and she had to support him. I reminded her that my father left her that house specifically, so she'd always have a place to live no matter what happened. She started crying and said Dennis promised he could turn the business around if he just had one more chance. I asked if she'd signed the application, and she said yes, but the bank hadn't approved it yet. My heart sank because she'd already agreed to risk everything. I took a breath and tried to stay calm. I told my mother I would pay for her to meet with a financial advisor independently, someone who could review her whole situation without Dennis being present. I said she needed to see the real numbers, understand how much money was already gone and how much danger she was in. She refused immediately. She said it would be a betrayal of her husband, and she trusted Dennis to make financial decisions for their family. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I asked her how it was a betrayal to protect herself, and she said I was trying to come between her and Dennis. I told her I was trying to help her keep the house my father left her, but she said I just didn't understand marriage and compromise. We went in circles for 20 minutes until I finally gave up. I told her the offer stood if she changed her mind, and then I ended the call before I said something I'd regret. I sat there feeling completely devastated that she was choosing potential financial ruin with Dennis over her own security. I had a therapy appointment with Lorelai 2 days later, and I broke down as soon as I sat on her couch. I told her everything about the house and Dennis's attempt to mortgage it and my mother refusing help. Lorelai listened and then said something that hurt, but I needed to hear. She said I cannot save my mother from choices she's actively making. She said my mother is an adult who is choosing to stay with Dennis and risk her financial security, and I have to accept that I can't control that. Lorelai said I could offer help and resources, but I couldn't force my mother to take them, and continuing to push would just hurt me without changing anything. She said the hardest part of loving someone is watching them make bad choices and knowing you can't stop them. I cried through most of the session because accepting that felt impossible. I wanted to protect my mother the way she never protected me, but Lorelai was right. My mother was making her own choices, and I had to let her face the consequences, even if it destroyed her financially. 2 weeks crawled by, and I heard nothing from my mother or Dennis. Then my phone rang early on a Tuesday morning, and it was my mother calling. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. She was crying so hard I could barely understand her at first. She said the bank denied the home equity line of credit because Dennis's credit score was too low, and the business financials were terrible. She sounded relieved and terrified at the same time. She said she was glad the bank said no because she'd been scared about risking the house, but now she was scared about what Dennis would do next. I asked her gently if she'd considered whether staying with someone who would risk her house was safe. She got defensive immediately and said I was twisting everything, that Dennis was just trying to save their future, and I was making him sound like a villain. I tried to explain that someone who loves her wouldn't pressure her to risk the house my father left her, but she talked over me saying I didn't understand their marriage. She hung up before I could say anything else. My phone rang again 10 minutes later from my mother's number. I answered thinking she was calling back to apologize, but it was Dennis's voice that came through the line. He was shaking with rage, his words coming out fast and sharp. He said I poisoned the bank against him, that I sabotaged his business on purpose, that I was trying to destroy his marriage to my mother. I told him I had nothing to do with the bank's decision, that his own finances and credit score did that. He called me a liar and said I must have contacted the bank to tell them not to approve the loan. I said that wasn't how banks worked and he needed to stop contacting me. He kept yelling about how I was ruining everything, and I was going to pay for what I'd done to him. I told him again that I had nothing to do with the bank, and he needed to stop blaming me for his own failures. He said this wasn't over and hung up. Then Dennis said something that made my blood run cold. He said he was going to sue me for what he called family contribution. He claimed that because he housed me from 14 to 18, I owed him compensation now that I had money. He said he'd kept receipts and records of everything he spent on me, and I was going to pay it all back plus interest. It was completely absurd legally, but it scared me emotionally because Dennis sounded serious. I told him he was welcome to try, but no lawyer would take that case. He said I'd be hearing from his attorney and hung up. My hands were shaking as I opened the voice recorder app on my phone and realized I'd been recording the whole call. I immediately sent the recording file to Caroline with a message asking if Dennis's threat had any legal standing. She called me back within an hour and said we needed to talk about next steps because Dennis was escalating in dangerous ways. Caroline called me back within 20 minutes of receiving the recording. She listened to the whole thing without interrupting, and when it finished, she was quiet for a moment before speaking. She told me Dennis had no legal claim whatsoever to my lottery winnings, and his threat was completely baseless intimidation. She explained that even if he had been my legal guardian, which he wasn't since my mother had full custody, he couldn't claim compensation for normal parenting expenses years after the fact. The rent he charged me as a minor was already legally questionable, and trying to use it as justification for demanding money now was absurd. But she also said we needed to take his threat seriously because desperate people do desperate things. She recommended we prepare a formal response through her law firm to shut down any actual legal filing before it started. She said she'd draft a letter explaining exactly why Dennis had no claim, and warning that any frivolous lawsuit would result in counterclaims for harassment and legal fees. I authorized her to send it immediately. The letter went out 2 days later via certified mail so we'd have proof Dennis received it. Caroline sent me a copy and I read it 3 times, feeling safer with each pass. The language was clear and firm, laying out the legal reality that Dennis had no standing to claim any portion of my winnings. It referenced the recording of his threat, documented his pattern of harassment, including showing up at my workplace, and stated clearly that any legal action would be met with aggressive defense and countersuits. The letter ended with a demand that Dennis cease all contact with me regarding money or face further legal consequences. For about a week after the letter arrived, everything went quiet. No calls from Dennis, no visits, no messages through my mother. I started to think maybe the legal threat had actually worked. Then my phone started buzzing with texts from my mother. The first one said I'd turned everything into a legal battle when we should be handling this as a family. The second said families shouldn't need lawyers to talk to each other. The third said my father would be so disappointed in how I was treating the people who raised me. Each message felt like a punch to the stomach, even though I knew she was just repeating whatever Dennis had told her to say. I wanted to respond, to defend myself, to explain that Dennis started this by demanding my money and threatening to sue me. But I knew from therapy with Lorelai that engaging would just feed the cycle. My mother would take whatever I said back to Dennis, he'd twist it into something else, and she'd come back with more guilt and manipulation. So I didn't respond to any of the texts. I just screenshot each one from my documentation file and tried to ignore how much they hurt. I threw myself into work, trying to create some normalcy despite the family chaos spinning around me. I had a big audit coming up for one of our major clients, and I focused all my energy on the numbers and spreadsheets. Work had always been my safe place, the one area of my life where I had complete control and clear rules. 2 weeks after the attorney letter, my boss called me into her office and I thought maybe someone had complained about my performance, or Dennis had somehow caused problems here too. Instead, she offered me a promotion to senior accountant with a substantial raise and my own team to manage. I sat there stunned for a moment before accepting. She said I'd earned it through consistently excellent work and leadership potential, and the firm wanted to invest in my future with them. Walking out of her office, I felt this rush of validation that I'd built something real and stable, completely separate from Dennis and my mother. My coworkers took me out to celebrate that evening, and for a few hours I forgot about the money drama entirely. We went to a nice restaurant and they toasted to my success and made me laugh with stories about office politics and difficult clients. Jeremy kept catching my eye across the table and smiling like he was genuinely proud of me, and I realized I had people in my life who cared about my achievements without wanting anything from me. The next day, I met with Gary to discuss long-term financial planning, now that I had both the lottery money and a higher salary. He suggested setting up a trust and investment accounts that would secure my financial future in ways that made my assets essentially unreachable, even if Dennis somehow found a lawyer willing to file a frivolous suit. We spent 2 hours going through options and I signed paperwork creating a revocable living trust with me as the sole beneficiary and trustee. Gary explained that the trust structure provided legal protection and tax benefits, while keeping me in complete control of the funds. He also helped me diversify my investments across different accounts and asset types, so I wasn't keeping everything in simple savings. By the time we finished, I had a financial fortress around everything I'd earned and won. Gary told me that even if Dennis filed a lawsuit, which he doubted any competent attorney would allow, my assets were now protected in ways that would make them legally impossible to touch. I left his office feeling safer than I had in months, like I'd finally built walls high enough to keep Dennis out of my life. 3 days later, the doorman at my condo building called my unit on the intercom. He sounded apologetic as he told me my stepfather was in the lobby asking to come up. My stomach dropped and I told him firmly not to allow Dennis access under any circumstances. The doorman said he understood and would handle it. I stood by my window looking down at the building entrance, watching Dennis pace back and forth on the sidewalk. He was gesturing and clearly arguing with the doorman through the glass doors. The confrontation went on for nearly 10 minutes before Dennis finally got back in his truck and drove away. I was shaking as I called the non-emergency police line to file a report. The officer who took my information was kind and professional, explaining that showing up once wasn't enough for a restraining order, but documenting the incident created a paper trail if Dennis escalated further. I gave him the case number from my harassment documentation and mentioned the attorney's cease and desist letter. He said I was doing everything right by keeping records and suggested I consider security cameras for my unit. After hanging up, I sat on my couch for a long time just trying to calm down. Dennis showing up at my home felt like a violation, even though he never made it past the lobby. Caroline called me the next morning after I emailed her about the incident. She said Dennis was clearly not responding to boundaries and suggested we try one final approach before pursuing a restraining order. She recommended arranging a mediation session with a professional mediator, where Dennis, my mother, and I could have a supervised conversation with a neutral third party present. She thought it might provide closure, or at least establish a clear final boundary that even Dennis couldn't misunderstand. I was skeptical because I didn't think Dennis was capable of reasonable conversation, but Caroline said sometimes having an objective professional witness to someone's behavior made it undeniable. I agreed to try, partly because I hoped it might help my mother see the situation more clearly when someone outside the family pointed out how unreasonable Dennis was being. Caroline arranged the session for the following week at a mediation center downtown. The mediation session was scheduled for 2 p.m. on a Thursday. I arrived 15 minutes early and sat in the waiting room trying to keep my hands from shaking. My mother showed up next, looking tired and nervous. She gave me a small, sad smile, but didn't try to hug me or start a conversation. Then Dennis walked in carrying a thick manila folder, his face set in grim determination. The mediator introduced herself as someone who specialized in family financial disputes and explained the ground rules. Everyone would have a chance to speak without interruption. The goal was finding common ground, and she was there to facilitate, not to judge. Dennis immediately jumped in before she even finished, opening his folder and pulling out pages of handwritten calculations. He said he'd documented everything he spent on me from age 14 to 18, and I owed him $47,000. The mediator asked to see his numbers, and Dennis handed them over proudly like he'd built an airtight case. She reviewed the pages carefully, her expression neutral, then asked Dennis to explain his methodology. He said he'd itemized rent, food, utilities, clothing, school supplies, and even calculated the value of the bedroom I used. The mediator looked at me and asked if I had anything to say about these calculations. I told her I'd paid Dennis $300 a month rent from age 16 to 18, which totaled over $7,000, and pointed out that charging a minor child rent and then itemizing normal parenting expenses wasn't legally valid. The mediator nodded slowly and told Dennis that parents have a legal obligation to provide for minor children, and cannot later demand reimbursement for fulfilling that obligation. My mother started crying, her shoulders shaking as she pressed tissues to her eyes. She said she just wanted her family to get along, and couldn't we find some kind of compromise that would make everyone happy? The mediator asked her gently what kind of compromise she had in mind. My mother said maybe I could help them with the business debt, not the full amount Dennis wanted, but something to show I cared about their well-being. I took a deep breath and explained as calmly as I could that I'd already compromised by maintaining any relationship at all after being kicked out at 18. I said I'd built my entire adult life without their help or support, and I wasn't obligated to fund Dennis's failing business just because I got lucky with a lottery ticket. The mediator turned to Dennis and asked him directly what he hoped to achieve from this mediation. Dennis leaned forward and said he wanted what was fair, that family should support family, and I had more money than I needed while they were struggling. The mediator asked him to define fair in specific terms. Dennis said fair was me recognizing that he and my mother sacrificed to raise me, and I owed them for that sacrifice. I felt something break loose inside me, all the years of biting my tongue and staying quiet. I told Dennis that fair would have been him not charging me rent when I was 16 years old and working 20 hours a week during high school. Fair would have been him not kicking me out at 18 with 30 days' notice. Fair would have been him not demanding $200,000 of my lottery winnings like he had some right to them. Fair would have been him not harassing me at my workplace and showing up at my home after I said no. Fair would have been him being an actual parent instead of a landlord who resented my existence. The mediator sat back in her chair and looked between the three of us. She said clearly that Dennis had no legal standing to claim any portion of my lottery winnings, and that his pattern of behavior constituted harassment. She asked if there was any possibility of resolving this through voluntary family support, and I said no, there wasn't. Dennis stood up abruptly and said this was a waste of time, that the mediator was biased against him. The session ended with no resolution, and Dennis storming out while my mother gathered her things slowly. My mother caught me in the hallway outside the mediation room before I could leave. She asked if we could talk privately for just a minute. I almost said no, but something in her face made me agree. We sat on a bench in the building lobby and she twisted her hands together nervously. She admitted that Dennis had been impossible to live with since I refused to give him money, that he blamed her for raising an ungrateful daughter, that their marriage was more strained than it had ever been. I waited for her to say she was leaving him, or that she finally saw how wrong his behavior was, but instead she just said she didn't know what to do anymore. She said Dennis was angry all the time and she was tired of being caught in the middle between us. I told her gently that she wasn't caught in the middle. She was choosing to stay with someone who was harassing her daughter and trying to steal money I'd won through pure luck. She flinched at the word stealing but didn't deny it. She said marriage was complicated and I didn't understand the full situation. I said I understood enough to know she was choosing Dennis's comfort over my safety and well-being, just like she had when I was younger. She started crying again and said she wished things were different, but she didn't know how to fix any of this. I stood up and told her I loved her, but I couldn't keep having the same conversation where she acknowledged the problem, but refused to change anything. She nodded and wiped her eyes and I walked away, knowing nothing had really changed at all. I drove home in a daze after the mediation session ended. My mother's admission that Dennis made her life difficult, but her refusal to change anything played on a loop in my head. I parked in my condo garage and sat there for 20 minutes before going inside. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother asking if we could talk soon. I didn't respond right away. I needed to figure out what I actually wanted from a relationship with her, if anything was even possible anymore. The next morning, I called her and asked to meet for coffee, just the two of us. She agreed immediately, sounding hopeful in a way that made my chest hurt. We met at a cafe halfway between our homes, neutral territory where Dennis wouldn't show up. My mother looked tired when she arrived, dark circles under her eyes and her hands shaking slightly as she stirred sugar into her coffee. I waited for her to speak first, but she just looked at me with sad eyes. I told her I loved her and I always would, but I couldn't keep having a relationship where she enabled Dennis to harass me. She started to protest and I held up my hand. I explained that I needed one clear boundary. She could contact me directly anytime she wanted to build our relationship, talk about her life, share things that mattered to her. But any mention of money, any pressure to reconcile with Dennis, any attempt to guilt me about my choices would result in me ending the conversation immediately. She wiped tears from her face and asked if I really meant that. I told her I'd never been more serious about anything. She nodded slowly and said she would try, though her voice shook when she said it. I wasn't sure she could stick to it. Dennis had controlled her for so long that I doubted she knew how to have a conversation without considering what he would think. We finished our coffee in uncomfortable silence and hugged briefly in the parking lot before going our separate ways. That evening, my phone buzzed with a text from my mother's number. The message was clearly from Dennis. He wrote that I would regret choosing money over family, that karma would catch up to me, that I was making the biggest mistake of my life. I screenshot the message immediately and forwarded it to Caroline with a note about the continued harassment. Then I blocked my mother's number. I felt guilty blocking her, but I needed space from the constant emotional manipulation. The silence that followed was peaceful in a way I hadn't expected. No angry calls, no guilt trips, no messages designed to make me feel like a terrible daughter. But the silence was also sad because it meant accepting that my mother couldn't or wouldn't protect our relationship from Dennis's interference. I spent the weekend cleaning my condo and organizing my finances with the new security measures Gary had helped me set up. Over the next month, I focused on building the life I actually wanted with the financial security I now had. I took time off work and booked a trip to Ireland, a place I'd always wanted to visit, but never thought I could afford. I walked through ancient castles and sat in tiny pubs listening to live music. I ate fresh seafood and hiked along dramatic cliffs overlooking the ocean. I didn't worry about costs or budget or whether I could afford the nicer hotel room. The freedom felt strange at first, almost wrong, like I was being too indulgent. But I reminded myself that I'd earned this through years of hard work and pure luck, and I deserved to enjoy it. When I got back, I donated another chunk of money to causes that had helped me when I was struggling. The shelter that gave me a place to stay when I was 19 and between jobs. A food bank that kept me fed during my leanest months in college. A scholarship fund for community college students working full-time. Each donation felt meaningful in a way that buying things for myself didn't. I was turning my good fortune into help for people facing the same struggles I'd survived. I scheduled my regular session with Lorelai after I returned from Ireland. She asked how I was feeling about the situation with my mother and Dennis. I told her about blocking my mother's number and the strange mix of peace and sadness that followed. Lorelai helped me understand that I'd been mourning the loss of a real relationship with my mother since I was 18, maybe even longer. The lottery money didn't create the dysfunction in my family. It just made the dysfunction impossible to ignore anymore. All those years I'd hoped that somehow things would change, that my mother would stand up to Dennis, that we could have a normal mother-daughter relationship. The money forced me to see that those hopes were fantasies. My mother had made her choice over and over again, and that choice was Dennis. Lorelai asked how it felt to finally stop hoping for change. I admitted it was a relief mixed with grief. Relief because I could stop waiting for something that was never going to happen. Grief because accepting the reality meant letting go of the relationship I'd always wanted. The grief was real and heavy, but so was the relief. I felt lighter somehow, like I'd been carrying a weight I didn't realize was there until I set it down. A few weeks later, I drove across town to visit the landlady who had rented me a room when I was 18. Mrs. Reed was in her 80s now and still living in the same house. I called ahead and she remembered me immediately, invited me over for tea. When I arrived, she moved slowly, but her mind was sharp as ever. We sat in her kitchen drinking tea and she asked about my life. I told her about my job, my condo, and carefully mentioned that I'd come into some money recently. She smiled and said she always knew I'd do well. I asked how she was managing, and she admitted the house was getting hard to keep up with. The roof leaked in heavy rain. The plumbing made strange noises. She couldn't afford major repairs on her fixed income, and her children lived out of state. I told her I wanted to help and hired contractors to fix her roof and update her plumbing. She cried when the work was done and hugged me tight. She said helping me all those years ago was one of the best decisions she ever made. Her kindness reminded me that family wasn't just blood. Family was the people who showed up when you needed them. Jeremy invited me to lunch one afternoon and mentioned his sister ran a nonprofit organization. Lynette worked with young people aging out of foster care and kids from difficult family situations. Jeremy thought I might be interested in volunteering given my own experience. I met Lynette at her office the following week. She was warm and direct, explaining how the organization helped young people navigate the transition to independence. They provided housing assistance, job training, financial literacy classes, and emotional support. I told her about being kicked out at 18 and working my way through college. She said my accounting skills could help with their finances, and my personal experience could help mentor the young people they served. I started volunteering 2 evenings a week. I helped update their financial systems and sat in on budget planning meetings. But the most meaningful part was meeting the young people themselves. Kids who'd been kicked out by parents who didn't accept them. Teenagers forced to support themselves while finishing high school. Young adults trying to figure out college while working full-time and paying rent. Their stories reminded me of my own struggle. I helped them set up budgets and navigate financial aid applications. I talked them through conflicts with difficult family members and how to set boundaries. Helping them gave me a sense of purpose beyond just my own security. My experience surviving what I'd survived became something that could actually help other people. 3 months after the mediation session, my phone rang from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. It was my mother calling from a new number. Her voice sounded tired but calmer than I'd heard in months. She didn't mention Dennis or money. She asked how I was doing and told me about her garden, how the tomatoes were doing well this year, but the squirrels kept getting the strawberries. We talked for 20 minutes about normal things. Her book club, my trip to Ireland, the weather. It was the first normal conversation we'd had in months, and I felt cautiously hopeful. I didn't let my guard down completely, but I appreciated the effort. Before we hung up, my mother mentioned she'd started seeing a counselor. The stress of the past months had been overwhelming, and she needed help processing everything. She didn't apologize for her choices or acknowledge Dennis's behavior fully, but she seemed to be starting to recognize that something was wrong, that the situation wasn't sustainable. I encouraged her therapy work without pushing too hard. I knew she had to come to realizations on her own timeline. I couldn't force her to see what she wasn't ready to see. I met with Lynette to discuss a larger project I'd been thinking about. I wanted to invest a significant portion of my lottery winnings into a college fund program for students from difficult family situations. We could partner with her nonprofit to identify young people who were supporting themselves through school the way I had. The fund would cover expenses that made education possible: textbooks and supplies, application fees, emergency funds for unexpected costs. Lynette's eyes lit up when I explained the idea. She said this could change lives, that so many of the young people she worked with had the drive and intelligence for college, but lacked financial support. We spent weeks developing the program structure and application process. Setting it up felt right in a way nothing else had. I was turning my luck into real opportunity for others facing the same struggles I'd survived. 4 months later, Nathaniel called me on a Tuesday afternoon while I was reviewing tax returns at work. He sounded relieved and apologetic at the same time. Dennis's landscaping business had officially filed for bankruptcy that morning. Nathaniel had managed to exit the partnership 2 months earlier after seeing the financial disaster coming. He wanted me to know, so I could check on my mother's house. He said Dennis had been desperate near the end, trying to convince Nathaniel to mortgage his own home for the business. I thanked him for the warning and called Caroline as soon as I hung up. She walked me through checking the county property records online. The house was still solely in my mother's name. No liens, no mortgages, no claims against it. Dennis had tried but failed to use it as collateral. I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness knowing my mother's one real asset was safe, but her life with Dennis was probably about to get much harder. My mother called 3 days after the bankruptcy filing. Her voice was quiet and scared, but she wasn't asking for money. She just needed to talk to someone who would understand what losing the business meant. Dennis was angry all the time now, blaming everyone but himself. She was worried about how they would pay bills, whether they could afford to keep living in the house even though it was paid off. I listened without offering solutions or money. When she paused, I reminded her gently that she had options. She owned the house outright. She could leave Dennis and keep the one thing my father had left to protect her. She went silent for a long moment before saying she wasn't ready to think about that. I told her I understood, but the option existed whenever she was ready. We talked for a few more minutes about small things before she said she needed to go. At least I had said it clearly. At least she knew. 6 months after winning the lottery, I sat in my condo looking at the life I had built and felt genuinely content. The legal protections Caroline had helped me set up were solid. The financial structures Gary had created gave me long-term security. The therapy work with Lorelai had taught me how to maintain boundaries without guilt. The volunteer work with Lynette's nonprofit gave me purpose beyond my own situation. The college fund program was accepting applications from young people who reminded me of myself at 18. I had friends who supported me, professionals who validated my choices, and meaningful ways to use my money that aligned with what mattered to me. The family drama still hurt sometimes. I still wished my mother would choose herself over Dennis. I still felt angry about the years of manipulation and control. But those feelings didn't control my daily life anymore. They were part of my story, not the whole story. I had finally accepted what Lorelai had been telling me for months. I couldn't save my mother or change Dennis. I could only protect myself and help others facing similar struggles. My lottery win had given me financial security, but more than that, it had forced me to stop hoping my family would change and start building the life I actually deserved. I was proud of the boundaries I had set even when they were hard. I was proud of standing firm when Dennis and my mother pressured me. I was proud of the person I had become through all of this. For the first time in years, I felt genuinely excited about my future. Not because I had money, but because I had finally chosen myself.